Okay, are we good to go?
I believe so. Our participants are rolling in, so we'll probably just give folks about 30 seconds or so to get in the room and then we'll get going.
Okay, let's get started. Okay, welcome everyone to the second in the webinar series sponsored by the Climate Transformation Alliance on how to electrify buildings in Truckee, Tahoe. We are very fortunate today to have as our guest Dr. Luis Aguirre Torres, who is the Director of Financial Planning and Analysis and Financing Solutions at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. He's going to be talking with us about financing the costs of building decarbonization. I'm Deirdre Henderson. I am the co-lead of the North Tahoe chapter of 100% of the Citizens Climate Lobby, and also co-lead of 100% Renewable Truckee. We first made contact with Dr. Aguirre Torres during COVID. We learned that the city of Ithaca in upstate New York had set a very ambitious goal for decarbonizing all of its buildings by the year 2030. And we were very interested in learning how they were going to do that, and especially how they were going to finance the costs of doing that. We had a few conversations with Dr. Aguirre Torres when he was in that position. Then we saw him present about community electrification when he was a senior advisor at Rewiring America. And now in his position at NYSERDA, we wanted to catch up with him because he has been working for many years on how to finance building decarbonization in America, and is we think, one of the leading experts and one of the most interesting thinkers on how to do that. Dr. Luis Aguirre Torres holds a degree in computer engineering, a master's in computer science, and a PhD in electrical and electronic engineering from University College London. He also holds a certificate in financing and deploying clean energy from Yale and in systems thinking from Cornell University. And he is a member of the World Economic Forum's Senior Executive Group on Net Zero Carbon Cities, and a member of the Finance Committee at the National Association of State Energy Officials. So we are very grateful to have him here today and to learn about his experiences and his thinking about how we're all going to finance the costs of this very ambitious transition that we're trying to accomplish. So welcome, Dr. Aguirre Torres, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, it truly is a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate this invitation. When we were talking about, the possibility of me coming in and talking a little bit about my experience and, particularly my experience in Ithaca before I joined NYSERDA, I thought about it, and, it's one of those things that it was overhyped for a while, and then, it was taken down by other groups. So, there is a lot in the middle that hasn't been told, right? That we haven't really been able to discuss in a public forum. So today I really thought about it, and I was like, okay, let's just be real. Let's talk about everything that happened, how it happened, and how it could happen if we were to do things right from now on, right? So I do have a presentation. I'm contractually obligated to talk about where I work, so I'm going to start talking about NYSERDA, and but I'm going to start with this one because I really want you to think about how difficult it is to fit all of that in my business card. So first, my name is just too long, then my title is ridiculous, and then the name of the organization is just far too long. So my business cards look so busy that they're really annoying. But anyway, I really want to talk to you about my experience in New York State, and I think a lot of these can be translated to experience in other states. And please ask questions, put them in the chat, in the Q&A, whatever format you want. And I'll be happy to stop the presentation at any point if anything seems too important to let it just pass. So please feel free to do that. So if we move to the next one, please. So I want to tell you very quickly what NYSERDA is about. The next slide, please. So NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, we are the energy agency for the state of New York. We've been around for 50 years. We started as the Atomic Energy Agency. Then it was all about energy security, then about energy independence, and then it became, about energy in the context of climate change. And right now, we are the main agency in New York State in charge of implementing the climate goals. The state has very, very ambitious climate goals. But the idea is, to provide, the technical expertise on the technical side, on the policy side, on finance, so we can actually help the state make informed decisions and then, accelerate the energy transition. If we go to the next slide, please. NYSERDA has, very specific goals. Sorry, the state of New York has very specific goals, and NYSERDA is in charge of implementing most of them. If you look at this, we start from 2025. You can see that, a lot of the focus is on energy efficiency, but, a big important part of that is building decarbonization. The intention is truly to prepare buildings and the state for what's coming. So at the very beginning is just let's get it all right. Let's make sure that our grid is resilient, we have enough renewable energy and distributed resources, and make sure that our buildings are beginning to be as efficient as possible. Then, by 2030, the intention is to already, by efficiency and renewable energy, start displacing some of the fossil fuels, so we can actually achieve at least a 40% reduction compared to 1990. But then, the intention is to continue increasing the amount of renewable energy and also energy storage that we have in the system. And while we are doing that, making sure that we are electrifying homes. The goal the governor has is to have at least 1 million electrified homes by 2030 and have at least 1 million electrification ready homes. So this is, a tall order. And by 2035, the intention is to really have 100% light duty, zero emissions vehicles. And it is all, this was all written, before COVID. During COVID, there were some changes, but right now with the IRA and, all the geopolitical risks that exist, we haven't changed the goals. I don't think New York will change the goals. It just changes the way we actually tackle the problem. So the goal is, by 2050, that we will achieve an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And if we're going to do that, we need to truly decarbonize most, if not all, of our buildings in New York, which are responsible for at least a third of the emissions in the state. So we can go to the next one, please. So when we talk about, carbon neutral buildings, this is the ideal. This is what we always think about and imagine, right? We can think about, perfectly insulated house, from every perspective, making sure that it's, air sealed, and that every appliance that we have, from our television to our heat pumps, they are the most efficient that we can, that we have also, smart meters, smart thermostats, renewable energy on the rooftop, and, we're doing everything. So this is the ideal. And this is the starting point, because there's a huge delta between, this picture that you have in front of you and, a 1943 farmhouse in upstate New York. So the question really is, how do we get that 1943 farmhouse, all the way to what we are seeing on the screen? And it gets really tricky. The technology is there, the policies are there. So one of the main barriers is money. How do we finance that? And on the other hand, it is practically impossible for the state and the federal government to fund this entirely for everybody. So we need to involve the private sector, and we need to figure out a way of making sure that everybody participates. If we go to the next one, please. because at the end of the day, what we are talking about is one, energy efficiency, and for this we need to think in terms of thermal loads that in the Northeast particularly is the main consumption of fossil fuels. So we need to think about how we can electrify thermal loads to maximize energy efficiency and at the same time remove any fossil fuel combustion, which also requires maybe changing cooktops for induction and etc. At the same time, we want to increase resiliency, and part of that is perhaps adding renewable energy and energy storage, but doing it in a way that is flexible and allows us to actually contribute to the grid and making sure that the grid operates in the right way. And all of this needs to happen mostly because we want people to have better lives, and there are health issues associated with this. We talk some more now, but 3 years ago we were not really talking about indoor air quality and what it does. It's very funny because in the last 3 years, those of us who have been in this, we have seen this cultural war. When somebody said that we're going to take away your kitchens and your cooktops and like your natural gas stove, and people went up in arms because I don't want this because my family has cooked for generations in front of the stove and we like to inhale everything that comes with that. But the truth is we need to do this, and we need to do this for the American people. If we go to the next one, please. So part of what I want to share with you is next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So part of what I want to share with you is my experience in Ithaca, and I'm showing this because well, you're gonna get the punchline in a little bit, but it was really hard. And let me tell you the story. And as I say, I'm gonna tell you exactly how it happened, right? So during COVID, I was working somewhere else. I was working for the U.S. State Department. I was running a think tank that was working on climate change, and I was working in developing countries. And then with the pandemic, I was like, okay, I need to come back to the US, which is where my family lives. So I came back to the US, and we had been living in the city of Ithaca, and the city of Ithaca wanted to hire a director of sustainability to implement the Ithaca Green New Deal. The Ithaca Green New Deal was this huge dream, massive ambition that the city had to be carbon neutral by 2030, a whole city carbon neutral by 2030. So I came in, I applied for the job, I got the job, and then I was told, like, we don't have a plan, we have a dream, but we don't have a plan. So if you can be the guy who develops the plan, that'd be awesome. So, that was my job. So the first thing that we needed to do was to understand where the emissions were coming from. And the city of Ithaca, particularly because of the weather that we have and because of the type of population that we have, which is, predominantly students, we realized that about 50% of the emissions came from buildings. And this was using normal, carbon accounting. When we started doing, advanced methane accounting, we realized that it was probably 60%. But let's go with conventional accounting. So 50%, of the emissions came from buildings, about 40% came from transportation, and 10% from everything else. So, it was obvious that we need to focus on transportation and building decarbonization. Then we went deep into, where the emissions in buildings come from. We started looking at, it was all about heating our buildings. It was all about cooling our buildings. Some of it was, from cooking. Some of it was from drying our clothes or washing our dishes. But at the end of the day, it was a big chunk was from heating our buildings, then water heating, and then, all of the different uses. So we realized that we needed to, do something with all the thermal loads in every building. So we started looking at this, more closely once we had, this whole map of, okay, this is where the emissions come from in the city. These are the type of buildings that we have. And we did a building inventory, right? We analyzed the building stock that we had in the city. And we realized that, we had some buildings that were like, 150 years old, some that were 100 years old, and some that were built after 1980. So we had a different set of buildings. And they were all built with different energy codes. They were all built with different construction codes. So it was unfair, to mandate that every single building would be retrofitted because the cost would be distributed not equitably. So we needed to think about, how can we do this so it doesn't cost people? And if it does, if anybody voluntarily wants to decarbonize their building, it cannot cost too much. So we started looking at this. And then we realized, and this is the first thing that I think was, the greatest discovery at the very beginning of the process, was that Ithaca is in the middle of nowhere. I could have known that by looking at the map, but the reality is that, you know, you live there, you don't realize how far you are from primary markets. And this is important because when we're thinking about this, like you think, okay, we can electrify thermal loads, and that is I can replace my natural gas furnace with heat pumps. Okay, we can do that. But then there wasn't anybody distributing heat pumps in our neighborhood, right? We needed to go to Rochester, we need to go to New York City. And it turns out that there is some sort of hidden tax in being a secondary market. So, and what that translates into is there was a lack of sophistication in our market, right, from an economic perspective. And the other thing that we started looking at this because we needed to size, you know, the problem. So we were like, okay, our market is just not sophisticated enough. And then when you think about it, just very few markets in every state are sophisticated enough, and that means have enough options so the price is not mandated by those who actually distribute the equipment. So the lack of sophistication was one, but then we started looking at how fragmented the whole thing was. You know, when I started doing, trying to do the numbers and identify how much it's going to cost to electrify the entire city, we started looking at, okay, if I need to do this, we took this house that I remember now, it was from 1960 something, and it was a single family house, but it was quite big, and it needed a lot of, repairs. And we realized that we needed a ton of money. But mostly we realized that we needed about 10 different contractors, 10 different companies that would come in, all of them with different profit profiles, all of them with different dates. And in trying to arrange that alone and given the timing for each one of them, we realized that there was an increase in cost. There was a tax associated with market fragmentation. So now we have, the lack of economic sophistication, and then we have an excess in market fragmentation. Those two things were contributing to, the cost of electrifying our buildings. But when we did the numbers, that extra was around 20% of the overall cost. So it was considerable. When you think about it, it was a chunk that nobody was thinking about. So then there's the stuff that you need to do at home, right, to electrify all the thermal loads. But then there is the stuff that you need to do, market-wide. Because at the end of the day, and this is perhaps one of the most important lessons, is we were dealing with a market failure in which the negative externalities were never incorporated into the model, right? There was nothing to gain from having a fully electrified building from a market perspective. So if we were able to bring it as part of the economic model in the city, then we thought that we would be able to fix this market failure. So anyway, we continued looking into this, and then we decided that, that house that I was thinking, it's a 2-story house with a basement, and it was 4 people living in that house. It was going to cost around, over $30,000. And this is, pre-crazy inflation numbers, right? So it was about, $30,000 to $35,000. And then we started looking at, okay, where can the money come from? This is before the IRA. We were talking about Build Back Better at the time, but mostly we were talking about the state of New York wanting to put incentives towards this. So we were like, okay, there is money that could come from government. And then we realized, but not $30,000 for every building. So perhaps we need to think about where the rest of the money could come. And then we saw, okay, if we manage to fix, like, let's say that I announced that I'm going to electrify the entire city. And this is the genesis of how we came up with electrifying the entire city in one go. We're like, okay, if I announce this, like it's like the field of dreams, like if we announce it, they will come. So a way of increasing economic sophistication in the city of Ithaca was by announcing it, by saying, like, I'm going to go for the whole enchilada. And if you want to be part of this, you need to come. And it worked. We had a number of companies from different towns around that wanted to participate in this. I was like, okay, well, that's very cool. And then we started like, okay, and how can we promote, the consolidation in the industry? Or like, okay, we issue an RFP. And in the RFP, as a city, we are requesting contractors to come in together, because we don't want to deal with 10 every time. We want to deal with just one, and that one could actually represent a number of contractors. But in that way, we can standardize contracting, and that was a lot of savings. Just thinking about, how do you standardize contracting, and at the same time, when you're thinking about financing, you're lending to one project, right? So the due diligence and the underwriting and everything is much easier because you're just dealing with one of them. So we were like, okay, we'll announce it, we'll have an RFP, and then somebody said, yeah, I mean, these guys will come and your field of dreams is all cool, fun and games, but then where is the workforce? And we're like, oh crap, the workforce. And then we started looking at, what do we have in Ithaca? Well, a lot of students and a lot of people that are working, in different trades, but we just didn't have enough people. And then we started saying, okay, if we're going to electrify 6,000 buildings in the next 8 years, like how many people do we need? And it turns out that we had a deficit of about 1,500 people. So the city needed 1,500 people that were not living in the city at that moment to come to the city to help us do this. So then we realized, okay, this is going to be very expensive if somebody lives in Syracuse and needs to travel 2 hours every day to come and work in Ithaca to electrify our buildings. And at the same time, if we have all these people moving to Ithaca at the same time, like we will not really have enough housing for them. So it was a problem. It was a real problem. So then we started looking at everything else. And to reduce the cost associated with labor, we figured that we could have a deal with other cities. And this was like honestly, that was one of those moments where you go like, this is it, this is the solution. So we went to cities that were about an hour radius from the city of Ithaca, and we, had a plan. We had an idea, and we established partnerships because Ithaca was going to be first, and the economic development that was going to come with this could actually eventually touch the cities. But if we were to train the workforce from all of these cities, then we could actually, facilitate the electrification of them. So we created something called the Green Jobs Corridor. And the Green Jobs Corridor included, some wraparound services for, people that needed childcare, people that needed transportation to come to the city of Ithaca and work in these buildings. So we had a couple of philanthropic organizations that were like, okay, I can help you. So they could pay for this. And suddenly, the cost associated with labor went down. So now we have, a way of dealing with economic sophistication, market fragmentation, and with labor. Now we need to get the equipment. But then again, we're talking about 6,000 buildings, let's say 2-3 heat pumps, air source heat pumps per building. So we're talking about, let's say 20,000 heat pumps. So you go to the main manufacturers and say like, look, I'm a city, my name is Ithaca, and I really want to electrify every building that I have. And I think I need like 20,000 of what you have. And they were like, well, if that is the case, we can definitely help you. So then suddenly, instead of having just Mitsubishi, then we have LG, and then we have Carrier, and then we have others. And then we started talking to all of them. And then somebody said, yeah, but the heat pump really is about, let's say, 40 to 50% of the cost. The rest is actually, the wiring, the ducting. A lot of it is the engineering, the sizing, the modeling. We're like, okay, so how do we deal with that now, right? So we started looking at how do we, reduce the cost side with that. And then we saw that everybody goes to Home Depot and everybody goes to Lowe's. Like, okay, what if we were to talk to them and we created some sort of loyalty program for anybody who wants to electrify a building and goes to Home Depot? And Home Depot was like, you know what? We might be able to help you with that, because if we're talking about the volume that you're talking about and the one Home Depot in town could actually help, then yeah, probably we can do that. So then we started thinking, okay, supply chain is important. We need to think about supply chain not only from heat pump, but everything that goes into that. And that's why it was so important for us to understand everything that goes into electrifying a building from a cost perspective. So now this is going to cost probably, less than $30,000, because initially that calculus was done with, all of these problems. But then, we did it again and we realized we are around $20,000 to $25,000. So I was like, okay, that's cool. And then New York State has NYSERDA, and NYSERDA has a very bureaucratic process. We're a government agency, and we need to be very responsible with the way we handle public funds. So it would be impossible for every building out of the 6,000 buildings that we had in Ithaca to apply for a grant to NYSERDA. So then we started engaging the state government and said, like, look, you have a ton of incentives. What if we were to put them all together? We were to pull the incentives and I pull my resources. Let's say that we do a double aggregation, and then we can actually think of a capital stack that uses some of those incentives. So initially what we thought was, okay, 6,000 buildings, $50,000 per building. We're talking about $300 million. Perhaps we can actually do this. And then, when you put together all the incentives coming from the state and the federal government, for the next 10 years, you could think about, let's say like at 30% of the total of the capital stack. So now we're left with like, okay, now we have a problem that is less than what it was before, and it's really just for 2/3 of what we needed. And that's when we were like, okay, we ran out of ideas and we ran out of money. So we need to figure this out. And then private sector came in, so we were thinking, okay, when you think about this not being part of the economic model means that nobody's going to be interested in investing. So how can we make this an inherent part of the economic model in the city? Do we have a rating system? So if somebody invests in a building, the building's not the assessed value, but the market value goes up because it has this certification. And then we started thinking, okay, how can we do this? And we looked at different models. Like we thought, like, what if we were to lease the entire building? What if we were to, lease not only the heat pump, but everything that we're putting into the building? And then, there's tax credits associated with that. There are some benefits, and then we can securitize that. And then we were like, okay, this is just getting interesting, right? Because when we talk about finance and we talk about a loan to electrify a building, and we talk about market rates, then that's because you need to balance risk, and the risks associated with the building owner and with the contractor performing the work. But then when you have 6,000 buildings, then the risk basically gets distributed. And when you have a selected pool and certified pool of contractors, then the risk associated with performance also goes away. And if you are dealing with supply chain, the risk associated with supply chain also goes away. So suddenly we're not talking about 10 to 15% interest rates. We're talking about 5 to 7% interest rates. So then we're like, okay, well, that sounds good. What if we were to put everything together? Let's say we pool, all of the buildings, we bring enough money from, a Wall Street bank, and we actually say like, look, you don't need to make a ton of money for every building, but you're going to make a ton of money in volume from here. So let's say we get $200 million, and there is a 7% interest rate from those $200 million. We can actually reallocate some of the state and federal money to cover some of that. We can actually get insurance, and we can get some philanthropic money to buy down the interest rates. And then at some point we realized that we were able to create a capital stack that would include government incentives, philanthropic capital, reduced interest rates, and potentially some money that the city could put towards this. And then we realized that we had covered about 80% of the total cost of electrification for every building in average. So then we're like, okay, that sounds cool. But what happens with people that don't have enough money for that 20%? What happens with people that, make 50% of the area median income? And the answer was, well, we need to think about this in the context of those who make 150 or 300% the area median income. Like, how can we actually create these in the same way that, and I always use this as an example, but it's a bad example, but I think about CDOs, exactly what created the financial crisis of 2008. But what I want to take from that is, can we actually stack good and bad, but in a limited way, in a closed environment, so we are not really, recreating the problem. And the answer was like, we can do this if we do it right. So the final thing that we did was, okay, what if we separate this? What if we separate commercial and mixed use buildings from residential buildings? And in residential, what if we separate, the small ones with the big ones, and we start looking at things differently? And then we create a financing facility for each one of them, because the risk profile for a commercial building, for a mixed use building, for a single family building, is different. But instead of pulling all 6,000 buildings, what if we were to, okay, let's create a pool of residential, a pool of commercial, a pool of mixed use, different risk profiles. The interest rate will be the same. Perhaps on the commercial side, we can go higher, so we can go lower on the residential side. And then suddenly we had a program that, like for a single family, was like, okay, we can do this. So it was all good. And we went and we talked to Goldman Sachs, we talked to Bank of America, we talked to a bunch of people, and then we found this company called Block Power that, for a moment were unknown. Eventually they became famous, and now I don't know what they are. But at the time, we talked to them and they were like, okay, we can help you with that. We can help you raise the necessary money, and we can create a financing facility. And what we can do is that money comes, to us. The state incentives and the federal incentives come to us. And now that we have that money, we can actually use it not only for electrification, because not everything is going to happen at the same time. And the moment you lend money, there's going to be interest and principal payments back. And some of that money can be used towards workforce. And we're like, okay, well, that all seems good, right? Because at the same time, we need to train, the workforce, because we agree with our partners to do that. So it all seemed fantastic. And then the problems began, right? You want to go to the next slide, please? So everybody was excited about this, and everybody was talking about it with so much enthusiasm, right? And the problem was that at some point, inflation came. And inflation hit everything in a very different way. I don't know if you saw, but for example, heat pumps went up about 150%, in just a year. Some of the materials needed, for electrification went up like 30%, 40%. Heat pumps for water heating, for example, went up like 400%. So inflation hit everything in a very different way, but the way it hit capital was where things got really interesting. Because when we set this up, we didn't hedge it. That is, we didn't, fix the interest rate. We didn't fix the number of buildings. We didn't have a pipeline large enough to guarantee that this was going to get done in a particular time. And then everything started just, little by little collapsing, right? And because things were expensive, then these coalitions that partnerships that were created started disintegrating. Some companies that had more of a presence in Ithaca decided to work on their own instead of working with the city, and they decided to go their own way. And they, because they dominated the market, they were able to charge probably a little bit more. Things started just getting, worse and worse by the minute. And then somebody decided to write a story saying, well, what they did is to sell the town, to Wall Street. And we didn't. We really meant well, right? But, somebody got hold of some people and started talking about how the city of Ithaca, from the very beginning, decided to, pretty much give all the benefits of this to Wall Street banks. Our argument was it is impossible to do this without private sector participation. There is just not enough money in government. There is a lot that you can do, to stimulate the market. There is a lot that you can do to animate, private capital participation, but there is very little that you can do to get people that are ideologically against electrification and that don't believe in climate change, to participate in this. One of the things that we did was to look at our demographic, and that was really important. And then we realized that, about 30% of the city were on the other side of the political spectrum. And we figured that that 30% was never going to do electrification, right? Unless there was a mandate. So we figured, okay, let's work with the other 70%. And then we realized that about 12%, the Tesla owners, they were already going to do this no matter what, because they like to be ahead. So we didn't need to deal with them. Just making enough noise would attract them. So then we were left at the end with like 60%. And in that 60%, we realized that a large number of them, because of being low income, could access state incentives to do this and get it funded 100%. So then we were left with 30% of the population. And we were like, okay, if we need to do this for 30%, and that is the notch from a behavioral economics point of view, if that's the notch, then we can focus on that 30%. And as it turns out, that 30% understands financing because they have a mortgage. So they know what is financing and the cost of financing. So it might be easier. So we started focusing on that. And then, the problem came that the cost of capital went up. The cost of electrification went up. Even though we managed to bring this down to 25,000, it went back up to 50,000 in just a year. So then suddenly, having all of this money, having all of this scheme, and having all of this, was taken down by the interpretation of what had happened. Because the problem wasn't that we sold the town. The problem was the money just got more expensive in the entire planet. And the US was not immune. This idea of exceptionalism in the US, it doesn't apply here. So we were actually, suddenly we were seeing a program that was more expensive. So things got complicated from that moment because we needed to think about it differently. That's when I left. That's when I left the city of Ithaca to join Rewire in America as a senior advisor. I did not leave because of the state of the program. Actually, when I left, the program was still, operational. And I think the people, the team that inherited this project did a fantastic job at keeping it alive. And, somehow they weathered, the little, inflation and economic problems that we saw in the last 18 months. And now they're coming back perhaps stronger than ever with a different, economic and financial model to, complete the task of electrifying every single building by 2030. But if we go to the next one, please. So the thing is, when you start looking at this, you need to think about the cost of doing one thing, the cost of doing everything at the same time. But when you think about the cost of doing everything at the same time, there is a political cost that needs to be calculated and a dollar sign has to be attached to it. Like, it is really important. We started thinking about the different ways in which we could do this. And what we show here, it's meant to be for PowerPoint, so it's not a very precise slide, but we're saying like, okay, if we go for everything, like the 100% plan, which is the one that we wanted to implement, that would mean that we need to do a ton of things, but we didn't take into account, some of the hidden costs associated with going for something as complicated as that. And that included political attacks, that included this idea that we didn't need to focus on the 30% that was not going to do it anyway, came back to bite us. I mean, at the end of the day, it was a very strong group of people in the city of Ithaca that opposed this, and we gave them enough ammunition for them to come and attack the program. So right now, what you see on the left is, what is the focus? The focus remains the same in the city of Ithaca. Remains electrification would achieve 45% reduction in emissions. Energy efficiency would achieve 35% of emissions. So that's the focus, that will take us 80% to where we need to go. Then, we need to work on our grid, and we need to work on, perhaps some loads that cannot be electrified and figure it out. But, right now, it is simplified to this. Let's focus on electrification and energy efficiency, and let's do it in a way that we can do it, thinking about how money can actually be volatile and the cost of that capital could go through the roof in any moment. So we need to think about schemes, and we need to think about ways in which we can actually do this. We can go to the next one. So I just want to tell you very briefly about what we're doing in NYSERDA. That has to do with everything that I just discussed, right? So as I mentioned, NYSERDA is the state energy agency for New York. We have a division which is called the Green Bank. The New York Green Bank is not a separate entity; it's a division of NYSERDA, and it works together with New York Sun, which is in charge of promoting solar energy. Our energy and climate equity strategy is a group of people that is making sure that every program that we implement actually meets the requirement to benefit at least 35 or 40% of the low-income households in the state of New York. We have a program called Green Jobs, Green New York that issues about $2 million in $20,000 loans on a weekly basis. That is one of my programs. And that program is basically issuing loans at concessionary rates. And here is, and all the learnings in Ithaca, for example, come to fit a little bit into this program, because market rate interest rates right now to do this are, around 14 to 17%. Green Jobs, Green New York offers 3.5% interest rates for anybody who wants to electrify their home in New York. And that means that those interest rates need to be subsidized by the government. So you have the option of giving money to people, paying for things. And because everything that is in between, there is an efficiency of, let's say, 50 to 70%. But if you subsidize interest rates, there is an increase in efficiency for every public dollar that you're using. So there are ways of looking at this and trying to think, where you get, the most for your money. Then there is the grid modernization program, which is, one of the problems that we saw in Ithaca. It doesn't matter how much money you throw to the problem. If the infrastructure is not there, you cannot do it. We had some neighborhoods where the distribution grid was at capacity. So if you were to electrify, the whole thing, would be impossible. So you really needed to make sure that we had the right substation, the right transformers, the right cables and everything else. So that was another problem. So in general, we have all of these. And the other one I want to emphasize is Empower Plus. And Empower Plus is really a program that was designed to help subsidize some of the low-income households wanting to electrify or to apply energy efficiency measures. This is a program that will be in charge in New York State to distributing all the IRA incentives. So right now, what we have and a way of looking at this is our Empower Plus program that includes all the subsidies that the state gives to people wanting to apply energy efficiency measures or electrify, is going to be supplemented by federal incentives. And these federal incentives will actually come in to help reduce the cost. And then Green Jobs, Green New York, the program that I have, will come in as gap financing at a very concessionary rate. And what that means, if you think about it in a waterfall, you can think, okay, project costs $30,000. I apply IRA incentives here and here, and that brings the cost down to probably half. And then you apply some of the state incentives and Power Plus, and that brings the cost of the remaining cost to probably half. So now we're at a fourth of what we had before. So we can come in with Green Jobs, Green New York financing, and we can cover potentially, $7,000 that are left to cover. and we can do it at 3%, which basically is about 10% less than what you would get with any other bank. And if you think about it financially, you kind of make money in the process. There are other slides, but I think I talked already for a lot of time, so maybe we can move to questions. I think this was, or no, if you can go one more, please, or let me see which one. If we can move to the last slide, please, before the map. One more. Okay, let's go here. So just very quickly, I want to summarize, right? We want to make sure that there are market-focused interventions, because this is a market failure. If we don't address the market failure, we're never going to actually achieve much. We need to think about government incentives in a different way. It is very important to think about the efficiency of every dollar that comes from the federal and state government. We need to think about tax credits. The IRA is 20% cash and 80% tax credits. This is a huge weapon. This is something that we are trying to use here. When you think about volume, it's not always possible. And, when you have imbalance in supply chain, volume is not always ideal. But we need to think about where concessionary lending can actually make a difference, and when market rate lending actually can work, with a particular sector of the population. Because at the same time, financing products are not only lending, a lot of the time is a credit enhancement that could help buy down interest rates. And then we need to think about the role of private capital. There is a role for private capital, and it doesn't mean that we're selling the city or selling anything. It just means that, we need to create the right conditions so we can incorporate all the externalities into the economic model, so there is a benefit for private capital to participate. And finally, once you have a pool of these loans or leases or service agreements, you can securitize, and then you can create a revolving fund, which happy to talk about that too if you want. But I want to stop here because I already talked for a lot and I was told not to do that. So I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. I think the next slide has my contact information if you want to put it there. There you go. So, well, thank you very much. Any questions?
Haley, do we have any questions?
There's none that have come in through the Q&A. So everyone attending, if there are any questions, feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat. Or I believe if you raise your hand, we can unmute you if you would like to speak on the call.
Luis, I have a question. One of the things, of course, that we deal with in our rural area is the shortage of qualified workers for building decarbonization work. Can you tell us what happened to the Green Jobs Corridor, how that worked, if it worked?
It did. It's still going. And I think that's one of the coolest things that we actually did. We partnered with a program, a California-based program called Roots of Success. And they started initially teaching in prisons, how to, electrify a home, like mostly different trades that would be applicable to the energy transition. So we partnered with them because they already had a program. And we started implementing this in Ithaca. And we had, I think by now they must be in the 10th cohort. And it was mostly focused on people living in rural areas. There was a large population that tends to be discounted. The first few cohorts were formerly incarcerated people, some undocumented immigrants. There were some people that want to change trades, people that were looking for their first job. We took them through a 10-week process, to train them. And then we partnered with the Department of Labor. Well, I think they're still doing it, for apprenticeship programs. So the Green Job Corridor was, I think successful. The cities of Syracuse, Elmira, Binghamton, and Ithaca, partner in that. And I really think that most of the people that were coming to the Roots of Success training program was, they were from just outside Ithaca. We didn't have that many coming from Syracuse or Binghamton, but we were creating job opportunities enough for people to come from other places. And the wraparound services are really important. And I think, getting the funding specifically for transportation and childcare, is perhaps one of the most important things that you need to do. I honestly don't know what happened with that. I haven't followed up on at that level, but the original program had some money allocated, or we were trying to get money so we could allocate it for transportation and childcare. And according to our own survey, that would really increase the number of people interested in participating in the program.
So when you were doing things like your own surveys and so forth, where did that funding come from? Was it initially philanthropic?
Yeah, there was a philanthropic organization in Ithaca called Park Foundation, and they funded a number of organizations, including Cornell Cooperative Extension, but also an organization called Building Bridges. And they were constantly, going, door by door, performing surveys or engaging people. Then we also had a program called 1000 Conversations, and we were trying to inspire people to record themselves and send it to us for a website, and we would have literally conversations with members of the community live on YouTube. So people were telling us, their perspective, their take on things, and we learned a lot from that. We didn't reach the 1000 conversations, but we did reach a large number, and we're able to gather a ton of data from there. But yeah, the answer is there is a lot of philanthropic, but there is a lot that you can do, to get people excited about it, I think.
Yeah, we've had 2 questions come in through Q&A. So I'll go ahead and read them. First one from Jan. The total amount of IRA rebates will only be sufficient for a small percentage of eligible households. How to use those rebates most effectively, and how to finance for those who will not get IRA incentives?
Well, it is true that it is highly insufficient. It's not enough money, even for low-income households. And I think because of the different requirements that come from the federal government, I think you allocate, the actual point of sale rebates to, anybody who's like 60% area median income, 60 to 80%, let's say. And in most cases, there are correlations with the type of housing and everything else. You should be able to cover most of the expenses. I think in depending on where you are, in California, for example, there are some specific programs that could come in for gap funding. Then the people who are in the middle, like 80 to 120% area median income, could actually benefit from the tax credits that are also part, 25C, that is also part from the IRA. So that's the way I think about that, right? Like, you start looking at income levels, you start looking at Justice 40, and the California has this tool for determining disadvantaged communities. So based on that, you are able to determine with whom you work first, and then who you use the tax credits for, and then where market rate lending actually makes a difference, if bought down by state dollars or federal dollars.
Thank you. The next question is from Rose. She says, really informative talk. Thank you. Could you talk more about working with private capital? That piece of it I'm most unfamiliar with. What was actually offered to the big banks?
Yeah. So when you're talking to private capital, that's their product. That's what they do for a living. They lend money and they get money back. And a lot of the time, when they give you a loan, they need to do underwriting, and this underwriting basically takes into account the risk of offering people a loan, and that has to do with debt to income ratios. It has to do with credit scores. It has to do with a number of things. So when you go one by one, then the risk tends to be higher. Well, when you pull projects or buildings, then the risk can go down. So when we looked at working with private capital, we really needed to see where risk was assessed. So working with banks, for example, you think about, okay, they are going to see risk in individuals with no job or with low income. They're going to see risk in projects using the latest technology because we don't know if the technology is going to work. They see risk in supply chain. They see risk in labor. So when they are, when you look at the risk perspective from anybody who's going to lend you money for this, then you can start addressing those. So when you come to talk to them, you start using their same language. You start talking to them in terms of how you are managing risk so you can guarantee there is a return. When you calculate interest rates, there is a component that has to do with profit. There is a component that has to do with the administrative cost of issuing the loan. There are fees associated with it, but then there is an element associated with risk. If you are able to manage risk to the point where it's minimal or zero, for example, and you can get to zero by providing a credit enhancement, for example, right? So in the case of Ithaca, we convinced the state government to provide a partial coverage for any potential portfolio losses that the lenders would have. So the government basically say, okay, of that pool of 6,000 buildings, if there is losses beyond 12%, we can start covering that. So 12% was reasonable. Anything over was possible, but now no longer a risk for the lenders. So the interest rate went down. And then what we did was to put a double layer of credit enhancement, because apart from the state government, we went to a philanthropic, and the philanthropic said, like, okay, I can cover 20%. So suddenly, we were protected against pretty much any losses that you could project. So those with the money saw that, okay, there is really no risk here in lending to low-income households. So then they were offering, better rates. You cannot get out of, at the end of the day, you're going to be stuck with some interest rate. Like, for example, right now, the state of New York, as I mentioned, we're offering Green Jobs Green New York 3.5% interest rates, which, is at least 10% less than, or at least 10 percentile points compared to what you get in the street. So when you do that, and then you start creating the necessary interest and volume, and then you identify other regional banks and CDFIs that want to participate, and that normally work at the local level. It helps them understand that the government is behind this program. And a lot of the time, if you can get a credit enhancement for them, you can get really, really low interest rates. But it's never free money. You can just play with your sources of funding to reduce interest rate, the cost associated with financing. And the idea is not to pass it to people. And just want to say one more thing. The idea, and there was a lot of confusion about this. We never meant for this program to be free. We meant for this program to have a zero cost of financing, which is different, right? And anybody who has a mortgage understands that, right? One thing is to get the money, and one thing is to get the money for nothing. So we wanted people to be able to get a loan without having to pay interest. But it wasn't that the banks were going to allow that. So we needed to find a way of covering that. So that was at the core of what we were trying to do.
Luis, were you able to demonstrate to people that while there would be a cost to doing this, cost of financing to doing this, that there would be offsetting reduced energy costs over time?
In some cases we did. I electrified my home. I did the whole thing. I did air sealing and insulation, and then I electrified every single thermal load, my kitchen, my heating, and everything else. And I did reduce, because my house was properly insulated, I did reduce my utility bills. But electricity is more expensive than gas. So in terms of energy consumption, it was less, but in terms of cost, it actually went up a little bit. So it is a hard sell a lot of the time, and for some people, there is a change of. What we saw was a change in behavior, and it's like when you get solar panels and then you start leaving the lights on all the time, and then the utility bill actually increases, because when you leave the lights on, it's because solar panels are not working. So people were getting higher bills now when they were installing solar panels. So we have seen a number of things and behaviors that a lot of the time negate the savings. But sometimes we did demonstrate that. Sometimes we didn't. I mean, actual bill savings are not always there. Energy savings tend to be there, but you need to take into account emissions factor, no? for that.
Can you
We
talk
have
about?
another one in the
Okay.
Q&A. Oh, Deirdre, do you want to go first?
No, go ahead. Go to the Q&A, please.
Another one from the Q&A. Do you see any potential financing from carbon credit markets by transferring funds to carbon emission reductions obtained by electrification retrofits? In Ithaca, there's an organization, Sustainable Finger Lakes, that does exactly that in collaboration with NYSERD, I believe.
Yes and no. I mean, I know the model that Finger Lakes has, but I think what needs to work is some sort of decarbonization certificate market in lieu of carbon offsets. And for that, you need to have recognition by, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the World Resources Institute, the Science-Based Target Initiative. So if we're able to do that and recognize those decarbonization certificates instead of carbon certificates, then we might be able to price this in a way that you can create a market. And what I mean with that is, for example, you're using natural gas to heat a home, and then you replace that with heat pumps, and heat pumps are going to be much more efficient, very likely, and there's going to be, considering the emissions factor from electricity and the emissions factor from natural gas, there's going to be some savings in terms of emissions, but those are the only ones that can be certified. But then what you are creating, if you create a market, you are creating a security, because people will start speculating around that, and there is a cost of regulating that, and it gets tricky. And that's why, I mean, if you want to do this formally, there is a work that needs to be done, but it can definitely work. And you just need to be able to certify those emissions. And the other thing is, if you do this, it cannot be just for the next 30 years. I mean, there is a limit in terms of the savings, and that's where a lot of us working exactly on this cannot agree on. Like, if we're talking about the useful life of the measure, or are we talking about the time between now and when the grid becomes cleaner. So it is a very interesting debate right now, but a lot of people, a lot of cities, a lot of organizations are working on that.
Luis, we have come to the end of our time. Thank you so much for this presentation. You've given us a lot to think about. I want to remind everybody that we will not have a webinar in August, but on September 12th, our next webinar will have as its guest representative from Block Power, which we heard a little bit about today from Luis. So thank you very much. Kaylee, do you have any last thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I'll just let everyone know, everyone who registered will receive an email with the follow-up materials, and the recording of this will be on the Climate Transformation Alliance website by the end of the week, hopefully. So we will send out an email when that is uploaded as well, so you can share it. And yeah, thank you so much. This was fascinating and really helpful for our region. Thank you for joining us.
I'm glad. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you, everyone, for attending. See you in September.
Bye.